Pestilence and Genocide. Excerpted from the book American Holocaust by David Stannard. Oxford University Press, 1992. p. 57. The Spain that Christopher Columbus and his crews left behind before dawn on August 3, 1492, as they sailed forth from Palos and out into the Atlantic, was for most of its people a land of violence, squalor, treachery, and intolerance. In this respect Spain was no different from the rest of Europe. Epidemic outbreaks of plague and smallpox, along with routine attacks of measles, influenza, diphtheria, typhus, typhoid fever, and more, frequently swept European cities and towns clean of 10 to 20% of their populations at a single stroke. As late as the mid-17th century more than 80,000 Londoners, 1 out of every 6 residents in the city, died from plague in a matter of months. And again, as with its companion diseases, the pestilence they called the Black Death returned. Like most of the other urban centers in Europe, says one historian who has specialized in the subject, every 25 or 30 years, sometimes more frequently, the city was convulsed by a great epidemic. Indeed, for centuries an individual's life chances in Europe's best house cities were so poor that the natural populations of the towns were in perpetual decline that was offset only by in-migration from the countryside. In-migration, says one historian, that was vital if the cities were to be preserved from extinction. Famine, too, was common. What J. H. Eliot has said of 16th-century Spain had held true throughout the continent for generations beyond memory: the rich ate, and ate to excess, watched by 1,000 hungry eyes as they consumed their gargantuan meals. The rest of the population starved. This was in normal times. The slightest fluctuation in food prices could cause the sudden deaths of additional tens of thousands who lived on the margins of perpetual hunger. So precarious was the existence of these multitudes in France that as late as the 17th century each average increase in the price of wheat or millet directly killed a proportion of the French population equal to nearly twice the percentage of Americans who died in the Civil War. That was the 17th century, when times were getting better. In the 15th and 16th centuries prices fluctuated constantly, leading people to complain, as a Spanish agriculturalist did in 1513, that today a pound of mutton costs as much as a whole sheep used to, a loaf as much as a fain eager, a bushel and a half of wheat, a pound of wax or oil as much as an arroba, 25 Spanish pounds. The result of this, as one French historian has observed, was that the epidemic that raged in Paris in 1482 fits the classic pattern: famine in the countryside, flight of the poor in search of help, then outbreak of disease in the city following upon the malnutrition. And in Spain the threat of famine in the countryside was especially omnipresent. Areas such as Castile and Andalusia were racked with harvest failures that brought on mass death repeatedly during the 15th century. But since both causes of death, disease and famine, were so common throughout Europe, many surviving records did not bother, or were unable, to make distinctions between them. Consequently, even today historians find it difficult or impossible to distinguish between those of the citizenry who died of disease and those who merely starved to death. Roadside ditches, filled with stagnant water, served as public latrines in the cities of the 15th century, and they would continue to do so for centuries to follow. So too would other noxious habits and public health hazards of the time persist on into the future, from the practice of leaving the decomposing offal of butchered animals to fester in the streets, to London's special problem, as historian Lawrence Stone puts it, of pores holes. These were large, deep, open pits in which were laid the bodies of the poor, side by side, row upon row. Only when the pit was filled with bodies was it finally covered over with earth. As one contemporary, quoted by Stone, delicately observed, "How noisome the stench is that rises from these holes so stowed with dead bodies, especially in sultry seasons and after rain." Along with the stench and repulsive appearance of the openly displayed dead, human and animal alike, a modern visitor to a European city in this era would be repelled by the appearance and the vile aromas given off by the living as well. Most people never bathed, not once in an entire lifetime. Almost everyone had his or her brush with smallpox and other deforming diseases that left survivors partially blinded, pock-marked, or crippled, while it was the norm for men and women to have bad breath from the rotting teeth and constant stomach disorders which can be documented from many sources, while suppurating ulcers, eczema, scabs, running sores and other nauseating skin diseases were extremely common, and often lasted for years. Street crime in most cities lurked around every corner. One especially popular technique for robbing someone was to drop a heavy rock or chunk of masonry on his head from an upper-story window and then to rifle the body for jewelry and money. This was a time, observes Norbert Elias, when it was one of the festive pleasures of Midsummer Date to burn alive 1 or 2 dozen cats, and when, as Joan Huizinga once put it, the continuous disruption of town and country by every kind of dangerous rabble, and the permanent threat of harsh and unreliable law enforcement nourished a feeling of universal uncertainty. With neither culturally developed systems of social obligation and restraint in place, nor effective police forces in their stead, the cities of Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries were little more than chaotic population agglomerates with entire sections serving as the residential turf of thieves and brigands, and where the wealthy were forced to hire torch-bearing bodyguards to accompany them out at night. In times of famine, cities and towns became the setting for food riots. And the largest riot of all, of course, though the word hardly does it justice, was the Peasants' War, which broke out in 1s24 following a series of local revolts that had been occurring repeatedly since the previous century. The Peasants' War killed over 100,000 people. As for rural life in calmer moments, Jean de la Bruyère's 17th-century description of human existence in the French countryside gives an apt summary of what historians for the past several decades have been uncovering in their research on rustic communities in Europe at large during the entire late medieval to early modern epoch. Sullen animals, male and female, are scattered over the country, dark, livid, scorched by the sun. Attached to the earth they dig up and turn over with invincible persistence. They have a kind of articulate speech, and when they rise to their feet, they show a human face, and, indeed, they are men. At night they retire to dens where they live on black bread, water, and roots. To be sure, La Bruyère was a satirist, and although, in the manner of all caricaturists, his portrait contains key elements of truth, it also is cruel in what it omits. And what it omits is the fact that these wretchedly poor country folk, for all their life-threatening deprivations, were not sullen animals. They were, in fact, people quite capable of experiencing the same feelings of tenderness and love and fear and sadness, however constricted by the limitations of their existence, as did, and do, all human beings in every corner of the globe. But what Lawrence Stone has said about the typical English village also was likely true throughout Europe at this time, that is, that because of the dismal social conditions and prevailing social values, it was a place filled with malice and hatred, its only unifying bond being the occasional episode of mass hysteria, which temporarily bound together the majority in order to harry and persecute the local witch. Indeed, as in England, there were towns on the continent where as many as a third of the population were accused of witchcraft and where 10 out of every 100 people were executed for it in a single year. In one small, remote locale within reputedly peaceful Switzerland, more than 3,300 people were killed in the late 16th and 17th century for allegedly satanic activities. The tiny village of Wiesensteg saw 63 women burned to death in 1 year alone, while in Obermarktal 54 people out of a total population of barely 700 died at the stake during a 3-year period. Thus, while it is true that the Europeans of those days possessed the same range of emotions that we do, as Stone puts it, it is noticeable that hate seems to have been more prominent an emotion than love. At the time La Bruyere was writing, which was a good bit later than the time of Columbus, during which time conditions had improved, the French knew every nuance of poverty. At the top were those who at best lived at subsistence level, at worst fell far below, while at the bottom were those described as dans un état d'indigence absolue, meaning that one had no food or adequate clothing or proper shelter, that one had parted with the few battered cooking pots and blankets which often constituted the main assets of a working-class family. Across the whole of France, between a third and half the population fell under one of these categories of destitution, and in regions such as Brittany, Western Normandy, Poitou, and the Massif the proportion ascended upwards of 2/3. In rural areas in general, between half and 90% of the population did not have land sufficient for their support, forcing them to migrate out, fall into permanent debt, or die. And France was hardly unique. In Genoa, writes historian Fernand Braudel, the homeless poor sold themselves as galley slaves every winter. They were fortunate to have that option. In more northern climes, during winter months, the indigent simply froze to death. The summer, on the other hand, was when the plague made its cyclical visitations. That is why, summer months, the wealthy left the cities to the poor. As Braudel points out elsewhere, Rome along with other towns was a graveyard of fever during times of warmer weather. Throughout Europe, about half the children born during this time died before reaching the age of 10. Among the poorer classes and in Spain particularly, which had an infant mortality rate almost 40% higher even than England's, things were much worse. In addition to exposure, disease, and malnutrition, one of the causes for such a high infant mortality rate, close to 3 out of 10 babies in Spain did not live to see their first birthdays, was abandonment. Thousands upon thousands of children who could not be cared for were simply left to die on dung heaps or in roadside ditches. Others were sold into slavery. East European children, particularly Romanians, seem to have been favorites of the 14th and 15th century slave trade, although many thousands of adults were enslaved as well. Child slaves, however, were as expensive as adults, for reasons best left to the imagination, as is indicated by a 14th century letter from a man involved in the business. "We are informed about the little slave girl you say you personally need," he wrote to his prospective client, "and about her features and age, and for what you want her. Whenever ships come from Romania, they should carry some slave girls, but keep in mind that little slave girls are as expensive as the grown ones, and there will be none that does not cost 50 to 60 florins if we want one of any value." Those purchasing female slaves of childbearing age sometimes were particularly lucky and received a free bonus of a baby on the way. As historian John Boswell has reported, 10 to 20% of the female slaves sold in Seville in the 15th century were pregnant or breastfeeding, and their infants were usually included with them at no extra cost. The wealthy had their problems too. They hungered after gold and silver. The Crusades, begun 4 centuries earlier, had increased the appetites of affluent Europeans for exotic foreign luxuries, for silks and spices, fine cotton, drugs, perfumes, and jewelry, material pleasures that required pay in bullion. Thus, gold had become for Europeans, in the words of one Venetian commentator of the time, the sinews of all government. Its mind, soul, its essence and its very life. The supply of the precious metal, by way of the Middle East and Africa, had always been uncertain. Now, however, the wars in Eastern Europe had nearly emptied the continent's coffers. A new supply, a more regular supply and preferably a cheaper supply was needed. Violence, of course, was everywhere, as alluded to above, but occasionally it took on an especially perverse character. In addition to the hunting down and burning of witches, which was an everyday affair in most locales, in Milan in 1476 a man was torn to pieces by an enraged mob and his dismembered limbs were then eaten by his tormentors. In Paris and Lyon, Huguenots were killed and butchered, and their various body parts were sold openly in the streets. Other eruptions of bizarre torture, murder, and ritual cannibalism were not uncommon. Such behavior, nonetheless, was not officially condoned, at least not usually. Indeed, wild and untrue accusations of such activities formed the basis for many of the witch hunts and religious persecutions, particularly of Jews during this time. In precisely those years when Columbus was trekking around Europe in search of support for his maritime adventures, the Inquisition was raging in Spain. Here, and elsewhere in Europe, those out of favor with the powerful, particularly those who were believed to be unchristian, were tortured and killed in the most ingenious of fashions, on the gallows, at the stake, on the rack, while others were crushed, beheaded, flayed alive, or drawn and quartered. P63. If it sounded like paradise, that was no accident. Paradise filled with gold. And when he came to describe the people he had met, Columbus's Adonic imagery never faltered. The people of this island and of all the other islands which I have found and seen, or have not seen, all go naked, men and women, as their mothers bore them, except that some women cover one place only with the leaf of a plant or with a net of cotton which they make for that purpose. They have no iron or steel or weapons, nor are they capable of using them, although they are well-built people of handsome stature, because they are wondrous timid. They are so artless and free with all they possess, that no one would believe it without having seen it. Of anything they have, if you ask them for it, they never say no, rather they invite the person to share it, and show as much love as if they were giving their hearts, and whether the thing be of value or of small price, at once they are content with whatever little thing of whatever kind may be given to them. P66. I certify to you that, with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the Church and of their Highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children, and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their Highnesses may command. And we shall take your goods, and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can, as to vassals who do not obey and refuse to receive their lord and resist and contradict him. A statement Spaniards were required to read to Indians they encountered in the New World. P69. Wherever the marauding, diseased, and heavily armed Spanish forces went out on patrol, accompanied by ferocious armored dogs that had been trained to kill and disembowel, they preyed on the local communities already plague enfeebled, forcing them to supply food and women and slaves, and whatever else the soldiers might desire. At virtually every previous landing on this trip Columbus's troops had gone ashore and killed indiscriminately, as though for sport, whatever animals and birds and natives they encountered, looting and destroying all they found, as the Admiral's son Fernando blithely put it. Once on Hispaniola, however, Columbus fell ill, whether from the flu or, more likely, from some other malady, and what little restraint he had maintained over his men disappeared as he went through a lengthy period of recuperation. The troops went wild, stealing, killing, raping, and torturing natives, trying to force them to divulge the whereabouts of the imagined treasure houses of gold. The Indians tried to retaliate by launching ineffective ambushes of stray Spaniards. But the combined killing force of Spanish diseases and Spanish military might was far greater than anything the natives could ever have imagined. Finally, they decided the best response was flight. Crops were left to rot in the fields as the Indians attempted to escape the frenzy of the conquistadors' attacks. Starvation then added its contribution, along with pestilence and mass murder, to the native people's woes. P70. The massacres continued. Columbus remained ill for months while his soldiers wandered freely. More than 50,000 natives were reported dead from these encounters by the time the admiral had recovered from his sickness. And when at last his health and strength had been restored, Columbus's response to his men's unorganized depredations was to organize them. In March of 1495 he massed together several hundred armored troops, cavalry, and a score or more of trained attack dogs. They set forth across the countryside, tearing into assembled masses of sick and unarmed native people, slaughtering them by the thousands. The pattern set by these raids would be the model the Spanish would follow for the next decade and beyond. As Bartolomé de las Casas, the most famous of the accompanying Spanish missionaries from that trip, recalled, "Once the Indians were in the woods, the next step was to form squadrons and pursue them, and whenever the Spaniards found them, they pitilessly slaughtered everyone like sheep in a corral." It was a general rule among Spaniards to be cruel, not just cruel, but extraordinarily cruel, so that harsh and bitter treatment would prevent Indians from daring to think of themselves as human beings or having a minute to think at all. So they would cut an Indian's hands and leave them dangling by a shred of skin, and they would send him on saying, "Go now, spread the news to your chiefs." They would test their swords and their manly strength on captured Indians and place bets on the slicing off of heads or the cutting of bodies in half with one blow. They burned or hanged captured chiefs. At least one chief, the man considered by Columbus to be Hispaniola's ranking native leader, was not burned or hanged, however. He was captured, put in chains, and sent off by ship for public display and imprisonment in Spain. Like most of the Indians who had been forced to make that voyage, though, he never made it to Seville, he died en route. With the same determination Columbus had shown in organizing his troops' previously disorganized and indiscriminate killings, the admiral then set about the task of systematizing their haphazard enslavement of the natives. Gold was all that they were seeking, so every Indian on the island who was not a child was ordered to deliver to the Spanish a certain amount of the precious ore every 3 months. When the gold was delivered, the individual was presented with a token to wear around his or her neck as proof that the tribute had been paid. Anyone found without the appropriate number of tokens had his hands cut off. Since Hispaniola's gold supply was far less than what the Spaniards' fantasies suggested, Indians who wished to survive were driven to seek out their quotas of the ore at the expense of other endeavors, including food production. The famines that had begun earlier, when the Indians attempted to hide from the Spanish murderers, now grew much worse, while new diseases that the Spanish carried with them preyed ever more intensely on the malnourished and weakened bodies of the natives, and the soldiers never ceased to take delight in killing just for fun. Spanish reports of their own murderous sadism during this time are legion. For a lark they tore babes from their mother's breast by their feet, and dashed their heads against the rocks. The bodies of other infants they spitted, together with their mothers and all who were before them, on their swords. On one famous occasion in Cuba, a troop of 100 or more Spaniards stopped by the banks of a dry river and sharpened their swords on the wet stones in its bed. Eager to compare the sharpness of their blades, reported an eyewitness to the events, they drew their weapons and began to rip open their bellies, to cut and kill those lambs, men, women, children, and old folk, all of whom were seated, off guard and frightened, watching the mares and the Spaniards. And within 2 credos, not a man of all of them there remains alive. The Spaniards enter the large house nearby, for this was happening at its door, and in the same way, with cuts and stabs, begin to kill as many as they found there, so that a stream of blood was running, as if a great number of cows had perished. To see the wounds which covered the bodies of the dead and dying was a spectacle of horror and dread. This particular slaughter began at the village of Zucao, where the townsfolk earlier had provided for the conquistadors a feast of cassava, fruit, and fish. From there it spread. No one knows just how many Indians the Spanish killed in this sadistic spree, but Las Casas put the number at well over 20,000 before the soldiers' thirst for horror had been slaked. Another report, this one by a group of concerned Dominican friars, concentrated on the way the Spanish soldiers treated native infants. Some Christians encounter an Indian woman, who was carrying in her arms a child at suck, and since the dog they had with them was hungry, they tore the child from the mother's arms and flung it still living to the dog, who proceeded to devour it before the mother's eyes. When there were among the prisoners some women who had recently given birth, if the newborn babes happened to cry, they seized them by the legs and hurled them against the rocks, or flung them into the jungle so that they would be certain to die there. Or, Las Casas again, in another incident he witnessed. The Spaniards found pleasure in inventing all kinds of odd cruelties, the more cruel the better, with which to spill human blood. They built a long gibbet, low enough for the toes to touch the ground and prevent strangling, and hang 13 natives at a time in honor of Christ our Savior and the 12 apostles. When the Indians were thus still alive and hanging, the Spaniards tested their strength and their blades against them, ripping chests open with one blow and exposing entrails, and there were those who did worse. Then, straw was wrapped around their torn bodies and they were burned alive. One man caught 2 children about 2 years old, pierced their throats with a dagger, then hurled them down a precipice. If some of this has a sickeningly familiar ring to readers who recall the massacres at My Lai Iron Song Mai and other Vietnamese villages in the not-too-distant past, the familiarity is reinforced by the term the Spanish used to describe their campaign of terror, pacification. But as horrific as those bloodbaths were in Vietnam, in sheer magnitude they were as nothing compared with what happened on the single island of Hispaniola 500 years ago. The island's population of about 8 million people at the time of Columbus's arrival in 1492 already had declined by 1/3 to a half before the year 1496 was out. And after 1496 the death rate, if anything, accelerated. In plotting on a graph the decline of Hispaniola's native population there appears a curious bulge, around the year 1510, when the diminishing numbers seem to stabilize and even grow a bit. Then the inexorable downward spiral toward extinction continues. What that little blip on the demographic record indicates is not, however, a moment of respite for the island's people, nor a contradiction to the overall pattern of Hispaniola's population freefall following Columbus's arrival. Rather, it is a shadowy and passing footnote to the Holocaust the Spanish at the same time were bringing to the rest of the Caribbean, for that fleeting instant of population stabilization was caused by the importation of tens of thousands of slaves from surrounding islands in the fruitless attempt by the Spanish to replace the dying natives of Hispaniola. But death seized these imported slaves as quickly as it had Hispaniola's natives. And thus, the islands of the Bahamas were rapidly stripped of perhaps 500,000 people, in large part for use as short-lived replacements by the Spanish for Hispaniola's nearly eradicated indigenous inhabitants. Then Cuba, with its enormous population, suffered the same fate. with the Caribbean's millions of native people thereby effectively liquidated in barely a quarter of a century. Forced through the murderous vortex of Spanish savagery and greed, the slavers turned next to the smaller islands off the mainland coast. The first trade took place in 1515 when natives from Guinea in the Bay Islands off Honduras were captured and taken to forced labor camps in depopulated Cuba. Other slave expeditions followed, and by 1525, when Cortés arrived in the region, all the Bay Islands themselves had been entirely shorn of their inhabitants. In order to exploit most fully the land and its populace, and to satisfy the increasingly dangerous and rebellion-organizing ambitions of his well-armed Spanish troops, Columbus instituted a program called the Repartimiento or Indian Grants, later referred to, in a revised version, as the system of encomiendas. This was a dividing up, not of the land, but of entire peoples and communities, and the bestowal of them upon a would-be Spanish master. The master was free to do what he wished with his people, have them plant, have them work in the mines, have them do anything, as Carl Sayer puts it, without limit or benefit of tenure. The result was an even greater increase in cruelty and a magnification of the firestorm of human devastation. Caring only for short-term material wealth that could be wrenched up from the earth, the Spanish overlords on Hispaniola removed their slaves to unfamiliar locales. The roads to the mines were like ant hills. Las Casas recalled, deprived them of food, and forced them to work until they dropped. At the mines and fields in which they labored, the Indians were herded together under the supervision of Spanish overseers, known as mineros in the mines and estancieros on the plantations, who treated the Indians with such rigor and inhumanity that they seemed the very ministers of hell, driving them day and night with beatings, kicks, lashes and blows, and calling them no sweeter names than dogs. Needless to say, some Indians attempted to escape from this. They were hunted down with mastiffs. When found, if not torn apart on the spot, they were returned and a show trial was held for them, and for the edification of other Indians who were made to stand and watch. The escapees were brought before the visitador, Spanish inspector magistrate, and the accuser, that is, the supposedly pious master, who accused them of being rebellious dogs and good-for-nothings and demanded stiff punishment. The visitador then had them tied to a post, and he himself, with his own hands, as the most honorable man in town, took a sailor's tarred whip as tough as iron, the kind they use in galleys, and flogged them until blood ran from their naked bodies, mere skin and bones from starvation. Then, leaving them for dead, he stopped and threatened the same punishment if they tried it again. Occasionally, when slaves were so broken by illness, malnutrition, or exhaustion unto death that they became incapable of further labor output, they were dismissed from the mines or the fields where they worked. Las Casas estimated that perhaps 10% of the Indian conscripts survived long enough for this to happen. However, he continued, when they were allowed to go home, they often found it deserted and had no other recourse than to go out into the woods to find food and to die. When they fell ill, which was very frequently because they are a delicate people unaccustomed to such work, the Spaniards did not believe them and pitilessly called them lazy dogs, and kicked and beat them, and when illness was apparent they sent them home as useless, giving them some cassava for the 20 to 80 league journey. They would go then, falling into the first stream and dying there in desperation. Others would hold on longer, but very few ever made it home. I sometimes came upon dead bodies on my way, and upon others who were gasping and moaning in their death agony, repeating hungry, hungry. In the face of utter hopelessness, the Indians began simply surrendering their lives. Some committed suicide. Many refused to have children, recognizing that their offspring, even if they successfully endured the Spanish cruelties, would only become slaves themselves. and others, wrote Las Casas, saw that without any offense on their part they were despoiled of their kingdoms, their lands and liberties, and of their lives, their wives, and homes. As they saw themselves each day perishing by the cruel and inhuman treatment of the Spaniards, crushed to the earth by the horses, cut in pieces by swords, eaten and torn by dogs, many buried alive and suffering all kinds of exquisite tortures, they decided to abandon themselves to their unhappy fate with no further struggles, placing themselves in the hands of their enemies that they might do with them as they liked. Other natives, in time, did find ways to become reunited with whatever remained of their families. But when most wives and husbands were brought back together, they were so exhausted and depressed on both sides that they had no mind for marital communication, and in this way they ceased to procreate. As for the newly born, they died early because their mothers, overworked and famished, had no milk to nurse them, and for this reason, while I was in Cuba, 7,000 babies died in 3 months. Some mothers even drowned their babies from sheer desperation, while others caused themselves to abort with certain herbs that produced stillborn children. In this way husbands died in the mines, wives died at work, and children died from lack of milk, while others had not time or energy for procreation, and in a short time this land, which was so great, so powerful and fertile, though so unfortunate, was depopulated. By 1496, we already have noted, the population of Hispaniola had fallen from 8 million to between 4 and 5 million. By 1508 it was down to less than 100,000. By 1518 it numbered less than 20,000. And by 1535, say the leading scholars on this grim topic, for all practical purposes, the native population was extinct. In less than the normal lifetime of a single human being, an entire culture of millions of people, thousands of years resident in their homeland, had been exterminated. The same fate befell the native peoples of the surrounding islands in the Caribbean as well. Of all the horrific genocides that have occurred in the 20th century against Armenians, Jews, Gypsies, Igbos, Bengalis, Timorese, Capuchins, Ugandans, and more, none has come close to destroying this many or this great a proportion of wholly innocent people. And then the Spanish turned their attention to the mainland of Mexico and Central America. The slaughter had barely begun. The exquisite city of Tenochtitlan was next. p. 82. The gratuitous killing and outright sadism that the Spanish soldiers had carried out on Hispaniola and in central Mexico was repeated in the long march to the south. Numerous reports, from numerous reporters, tell of Indians being led to the mines in columns, chained together at the neck, and decapitated if they faltered. Of children trapped and burned alive in their houses, or stabbed to death because they walked too slowly. Of the routine cutting off of women's breasts, and the tying of heavy cords to their feet before tossing them to drown in lakes and lagoons. Of babies taken from their mothers' breasts, killed, and left as roadside markers. Of stray Indians dismembered and sent back to their villages with their chopped-off hands and noses strung around their necks. Of pregnant and confined women, children, old men, as many as they could capture, thrown into pits in which stakes had been embedded and left stuck on the stakes, until the pits were filled. And much, much more. One favorite sport of the conquistadors was dogging. Traveling as they did with packs of armored wolfhounds and mastiffs that were raised on a diet of human flesh and were trained to disembowel Indians, the Spanish used the dogs to terrorize slaves and to entertain the troops. An entire book, Dogs of the Conquest, has been published recently, detailing the exploits of these animals as they accompanied their masters throughout the course of the Spanish depredations. A properly fleshed dog, these authors say, could pursue a savage as zealously and effectively as a deer or a boar. To many of the conquerors, the Indian was merely another savage animal, and the dogs were trained to pursue and rip apart their human quarry with the same zest as they felt when hunting wild beasts. Vasco Núñez de Balboa was famous for such exploits and, like others, he had his own favorite dog Leoncico, or Little Lion, a reddish-colored cross between a greyhound and a mastiff that was rewarded at the end of a campaign for the amount of killing it had done. On one much celebrated occasion, Leoncico tore the head off an Indian leader in Panama while Balboa, his men, and other dogs completed the slaughter of everyone in a village that had the ill fortune to lie in their journey's path. Heads of human adults do not come off easily, so the authors of Dogs of the Conquest seem correct in calling this a remarkable feat, although Balboa's men usually were able to do quite well by themselves. As one contemporary description of this same massacre notes, the Spaniards cut off the arm of one, the leg or hip of another, and from some their heads at one stroke, like butchers cutting up beef and mutton for market. 600, including the cacique, were thus slain like brute beasts. Vasco ordered 40 of them to be torn to pieces by dogs. Just as the Spanish soldiers seem to have particularly enjoyed testing the sharpness of their yard-long rapier blades on the bodies of Indian children, so their dogs seem to find the soft bodies of infants especially tasty, and thus the accounts of the invading conquistadors and the padres who traveled with them are filled with detailed descriptions of young Indian children routinely taken from their parents and fed to the hungry animals. p. 85. Overall in central Mexico, the population fell by almost 95% within 75 years following the Europeans' first appearance, from more than 25 million people in 1519 to barely 1,300,000 in 1595. p. 91. For the Andean society as a whole, within a century following their first encounter with the Spanish, 94–96% of their once enormous population had been exterminated. Along their 2,000 miles of coastline, where once 6,500,000 people had lived, everyone was dead. p. 135. The earliest European mariners and explorers in California repeatedly referred to the great numbers of Indians living there. In places where Vizcaino's ships could approach the coast or his men could go ashore, the captain recorded, again and again, that the land was thickly filled with people. And where he couldn't approach or go ashore because the coast was wild, the Indians signaled greetings by building fires that made so many columns of smoke on the mainland that at night it looked like a procession and in the daytime the sky was overcast. In sum, as Father Ascension put it, this realm of California is very large and embraces much territory, nearly all inhabited by numberless people. But not for very long. Throughout the late 16th and the 17th and 18th centuries, Spanish disease and Spanish cruelty took a large but mostly uncalculated toll. Few detailed records of what happened during that time exist, but a wealth of research in other locales has shown the early decades following Western contact to be almost invariably the worst for native people, because that is when the fires of epidemic disease burn most freely. Whatever the population of California was before the Spanish came, however, and whatever happened during the first few centuries following Spanish entry into the region, by 1845 the Indian population of California had been slashed to 150,000, down from many times that number prior to European contact, by swarming epidemics of influenza, diphtheria, measles, pneumonia, whooping cough, smallpox, malaria, typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis, dysentery, syphilis, and gonorrhea along with everyday settler and explorer violence. As late as 1833 a malaria epidemic brought in by some Hudson's Bay Company trappers killed 20,000 Indians by itself, wiping out entire parts of the Great Central Valleys. A decade later, writes one historian, there still remained macabre reminders of the malaria epidemic, collapsed houses filled with skulls and bones, the ground littered with skeletal remains. Terrible as such deaths must have been, if the lives that preceded them were lived outside the Spanish missions that were founded in the 18th century, the victims might have counted themselves lucky. 2 centuries earlier the Puritan minister John Robinson had complained to Plymouth's William Bradford that although a group of massacred Indians no doubt deserved to be killed, oh, how happy a thing had it been, if you had converted some before you had killed any. That was probably the only thing the New England Puritans and California's Spanish Catholics would have agreed upon. So, using armed Spanish troops to capture Indians and herd them into the mission stockades, the Spanish padres did their best to convert the natives before they killed them. And kill they did. First there were the Jesuit missions, founded early in the 18th century, and from which few vital statistics are available. Then the Franciscans took the Jesuits' place. At the mission of Nuestra Señora de Loreto, reported the Franciscan chronicler Father Francisco Pal, during the first 3 years of Franciscan rule 76 children and adults were baptized, while 131 were buried. At the mission of San Jose Cumandu during the same time period 94 were baptized, while 241 died. At the mission of Purísima de Cadagamo, meanwhile, 39 were baptized, 120 died. At the mission of Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe the figures were similar, 53 baptisms, 130 deaths. The same held true at others, from the mission of Santa Rosalia de Mulegé, with 48 baptisms and 113 deaths, to the mission of San Ignacio, with 115 baptisms and 293 deaths, all within the same initial 3-year period. p. 142. By 1845 the Indian population of California was down to no more than a quarter of what it had been when the Franciscan missions were established in 1769. That is, it had declined by at least 75% during 75 years of Spanish rule. In the course of just the next 25 years, under American rule, it would fall by another 80%. The gold rush brought to California a flood of American miners and ranchers who seemed to delight in killing Indians, miners and ranchers who rose to political power and prominence, and from those platforms not only legalized the enslavement of California Indians, but, as in Colorado and elsewhere, launched public campaigns of genocide with the explicitly stated goal of all-out Indian extermination. p. 145. Between 1852 and 1860, under American supervision, the indigenous population of California plunged from 85,000 to 35,000, a collapse of about 60% within 8 years of the first gubernatorial demands for the Indians' destruction. By 1890 that number was halved again. Now 80% of the natives who had been alive when California became a state had been wiped out by an official policy of genocide. Fewer than 18,000 California Indians were still living, and the number was continuing to drop. In the late 1840s and 1850s one observer of the California scene had watched his fellow American whites begin their furious assault upon the Indians, shooting them down like wolves, men, women, and children, wherever they could find them, and had warned that this war of extermination against the Aborigines, commenced in effect at the landing of Columbus, and continued to this day, is, gradually and surely tending to the final and utter extinction of the race. While to most white Californians such a conclusion was hardly lamentable, To this commentator it was a major concern, but only because the extermination policy has proved so injurious to the interests of the whites. That was because the Indians' labor, once very useful, and, in fact, indispensable in a country where no other species of laborers were to be obtained at any price, and which might now be rendered of immense value by pursuing a judicious policy, has been utterly sacrificed by this extensive system of indiscriminate revenge. p. 146. Between 95 and 98% of California's Indians had been exterminated in little more than a century. And even this ghastly numerical calculation is inadequate, not only because it reveals nothing of the hideous suffering endured by those hundreds of thousands of California native peoples, but because it is based on decline only from the estimated population for the year 1769, a population that already had been reduced savagely by earlier invasions of European plague and violence. Nationwide by this time only about 1/3 of 1% of America's population, 250,000 out of 76,000,000 people were natives. The worst human holocaust the world had ever witnessed, roaring across 2 continents non-stop for 4 centuries and consuming the lives of countless tens of millions of people, finally had leveled off. There was, at last, almost no one left to kill. p. 147. During the course of 4 centuries, from the 1490s to the 1890s, Europeans and white Americans engaged in an unbroken string of genocide campaigns against the native peoples of the Americas. American Holocaust.